The wedding photograph should not exist. Dr. Rebecca Walsh stared at her monitor in the empty basement of the Chicago Historical Society, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her desk. She had just increased the resolution on an 1887 wedding portrait from the Whitmore Estate Collection, and what she saw made her stomach turn. The bride's wrist was covered in bruises, not just one or two faint marks that could be explained away. Dark, vicious contusions encircled her left wrist, like a bracelet of violence, each one clearly showing the impression of fingertips. Someone had gripped this young woman hard enough to leave marks that were still visible on her wedding day. Hard enough that she could not hide them, even beneath the lace cuffs of her bridal gown. Rebecca zoomed in further, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The image became sharper. She could see everything now. 4 distinct bruises on top of the wrist where fingers had dug in. A darker mark underneath where a thumb had pressed into the soft flesh. This was not an accident. This was restraint. This was force. This was someone holding her down. She looked at the bride's face. Catherine Brennan, age 19, stared back at her across 138 years. The young woman's eyes were wide and dark, filled with something Rebecca recognized instantly from her time volunteering at the women's shelter during graduate school. Pure, undiluted terror. Her mouth was arranged in a smile, but it was all wrong. The lips were pressed too tightly together, the corners forced upward in a grotesque parody of happiness. Her jaw was clenched so hard that Rebecca could see the tension in her neck. Behind Catherine stood her groom, Thomas Whitmore. His hand rested on her shoulder, not gently, but with a possessive grip that made his knuckles stand out white against the dark fabric of his suit. He was at least 25 years older than his bride, with cold eyes and a thin, cruel mouth hidden beneath a thick mustache. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking down at Catherine, and his expression made Rebecca's blood run cold. She had catalogued thousands of Victorian wedding photographs. She knew the formal poses, the serious expressions required by long exposure times, the rigid propriety of the era. This was different. This was a predator and his prey captured forever on film. Rebecca's hand shook as she grabbed her notebook and searched the inventory list. Wedding portrait, Thomas Whitmore and Catherine Brennan, October 15, 1887. She pulled up the digital archives and began typing frantically, searching for anything else about Catherine Whitmore. The death certificate appeared on screen within seconds. Catherine Whitmore. Died March 12, 1888, just 5 months after her wedding. Cause of death: accidental fall downstairs. Rebecca felt ice water flood her veins. 5 months. This terrified 19-year-old girl had survived only 5 months of marriage before falling down the stairs. She pulled up the newspaper archives, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The Chicago Tribune article from March 14, 1888, was brief. Tragic death of young bride. Catherine Whitmore, 19, wife of prominent businessman Thomas Whitmore, died from injuries sustained in a fall at the family residence. No witnesses. The article noted that Thomas Whitmore was devastated by the loss. It mentioned that he had been married twice before. Both previous wives had also died young. Rebecca stopped breathing. She searched again, pulling up every document she could find about Thomas Whitmore. Birth records, property deeds, business transactions. And then she found the other death certificates. Margaret Whitmore, first wife, died 1879, age 21. Cause of death? Accidental drowning in bathtub. Sarah Whitmore, second wife, died 1883, age 23. Cause of death? Accidental fall from bedroom window. 3 wives, 3 accidents, 3 young women dead. Rebecca zoomed back in on Catherine's face in the wedding photograph, the bruises on her wrist, the terror in her eyes, the forced smile. This girl had known. On her wedding day, Catherine Brennan had known exactly what kind of man she was marrying. And someone had taken this photograph, had seen these marks, had looked into this young woman's terrified eyes, and had done nothing. Rebecca looked at the timestamp on the photograph file. She had discovered this image at 11:47 post-meridium on November 19th, 2025. Eleanor Whitmore, Thomas's granddaughter, had died 3 months ago and donated the entire family collection to the Historical Society. Everything Thomas Whitmore had hidden for over a century was now sitting in this basement archive, and Rebecca Walsh was going to expose every single secret. She pulled out her phone and began photographing the monitor, capturing every detail of Catherine's bruised wrist, her terrified expression, Thomas's predatory grip. Then she opened a new document and started making a list of everything she needed to find. Police records, witness statements, family letters. There had to be more evidence. There had to be someone who knew the truth. The photograph glowed on her screen in the dark basement. Catherine Brennan's eyes stared at her, silently screaming across time. Rebecca did not go home that night. By 3 a.m, she had pulled every single document related to Thomas Whitmore from the archive storage. The table in front of her was covered with photographs, letters, newspaper clippings, and legal documents. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago. Her eyes burned from staring at faded handwriting and 19th century typeface. But she could not stop. Every new piece of evidence she uncovered made her more certain that Thomas Whitmore had been a murderer who had hidden behind wealth and respectability for decades. She started with Margaret Whitmore, the first wife. The death certificate said, "Drowning in bathtub, 1879. Rebecca found the coroner's report buried in a folder of legal papers. Margaret had been found submerged in her bath by a housemaid. The water was cold. The coroner estimated she had been dead for at least 3 hours before discovery. There were no signs of struggle. The report concluded she must have fainted and slipped beneath the water. But then Rebecca found Margaret's letter. It was tucked inside a bundle of correspondence, written on expensive cream-colored paper in a delicate, shaking hand. The letter was addressed to Margaret's sister Elizabeth and dated 2 weeks before Margaret's death. Rebecca's hands trembled as she read. "Dearest Elizabeth, I am writing to you in desperation. Thomas has become increasingly volatile. Last Thursday, he flew into a rage over a minor household matter and struck me across the face. When I threatened to leave, he locked me in our bedroom for 2 days without food. I am frightened, Elizabeth. His moods are unpredictable, and his anger is terrifying. The servants are afraid of him. Even his business associates seem to avoid him when possible. I have made a grave mistake in this marriage. Please, if anything should happen to me, know that it was not an accident. Your loving sister, Margaret." Rebecca read the letter 3 times, her heart racing. This was evidence. This was proof that Margaret had feared for her life. And 2 weeks after writing this letter, she was found dead in her bathtub. Rebecca searched frantically through the documents, looking for any indication that Elizabeth had received this letter, that she had gone to the police, that someone had investigated. She found nothing. The letter had never been sent. It had remained in Thomas Whitmore's house, probably discovered by him after Margaret's death, kept as a trophy, or simply forgotten in the massive estate. Rebecca moved on to Sarah Whitmore, the second wife. Death certificate. Accidental fall from bedroom window, 1883. The police report was brief. Sarah had apparently fallen from the third-floor window of the master bedroom. A neighbor had heard screaming, then saw her body on the cobblestones below. Thomas told police that Sarah had been distraught over the death of her mother and had become hysterical. He claimed he had left her alone to calm down, and when he returned, she was gone, and the window was open. The neighbor's testimony was different. Rebecca found it in a separate file, a handwritten statement given to police by a woman named Grace Porter who lived in the house next door. Grace stated that she had heard shouting, a man's voice raised in anger, then a woman screaming, "No, please, no!" Then silence, then a crash. When she looked out her window, she saw Sarah's body on the street below, and Thomas Whitmore looking down from the bedroom window above. Grace said his expression was calm, almost emotionless. She told police she believed he had pushed his wife. The police had noted Grace's statement in their report. Then they had interviewed Thomas Whitmore, who was shocked and appalled by such accusations. Thomas explained that Grace Porter was a lonely spinster who had always been jealous of his happy marriages. He suggested she was mentally unstable. The police concluded there was insufficient evidence to pursue charges against such a respected businessman based on the testimony of a single, unreliable witness. Rebecca wanted to scream. Grace Porter had heard everything. She had seen Thomas at the window immediately after Sarah fell. And the police had dismissed her as a crazy spinster because Thomas Whitmore had money and reputation and power. She pulled out the wedding photograph of Catherine again. Now she understood the terror in that young woman's eyes. Catherine must have known about the other wives. Chicago was not such a large city in the 1880s. People talked. There must have been rumors, whispers, speculation, and yet Catherine had married him anyway. Rebecca searched through more documents and found the answer. Catherine's father, Patrick Brennan, had owed Thomas Whitmore a significant sum of money. She found the loan documents dated 1886, 1 year before the wedding. Patrick had borrowed $5,000 from Thomas to save his failing dry goods store. When he could not repay the loan, Thomas had offered a solution. "Marry me to your daughter, and the debt is forgiven." Catherine had been sold to a killer to pay her father's debt. Rebecca found one more document that made her physically ill. It was a brief diary entry in Thomas's own handwriting, dated October 20th, 1887, 5 days after his wedding to Catherine. The entry was chilling in its casual cruelty. Catherine continues to resist her wifely duties. She is stubborn and willful, unlike Margaret, who was properly obedient. Last night I was forced to discipline her severely when she attempted to lock the bedroom door against me. She learned slowly, but she will learn. They all learn eventually. Rebecca pushed away from the table and ran to the archive bathroom, barely making it before she vomited. When she finally stopped shaking, she washed her face with cold water and looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her skin was pale. She looked like she had seen a ghost. She had seen 3 ghosts. 3 young women who had died terrified and alone, murdered by a man who faced no consequences. Rebecca walked back to the archive table and gathered all the documents carefully. Margaret's unsent letter, Grace Porter's dismissed testimony, the loan papers that proved Catherine had been sold into marriage, Thomas's diary confession of abuse. She photographed everything with her phone, making sure every word was clearly visible. Then she picked up her office phone and dialed. Professor David Chen arrived at the Chicago Historical Society at 6 a.m, looking irritated and exhausted. Rebecca had called him 3 hours earlier, waking him from sleep with words that made him dress immediately and drive through the empty pre-dawn streets. "I found evidence of serial murder," she had said. "I need a forensic historian. Now." David was not just any historian. He had spent 15 years working with law enforcement, analyzing historical documents for cold cases, testifying in court about archival evidence. If anyone could help Rebecca build an airtight case against a man who had been dead for 80 years, it was him. She met him at the archive entrance, unlocking the door with shaking hands. He took one look at her face, and his irritation vanished. "Show me," he said simply. Rebecca spread everything across the table. The wedding photograph with Catherine's bruised wrist, Margaret's unsent letter, Grace Porter's dismissed testimony, the loan documents, Thomas's diary entry. David stood silently, moving from document to document, his expression growing darker with each piece of evidence. "This is a monster," he finally said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "This is a documented predator who bought and murdered 3 women, and nobody stopped him." "Can we prove it?" Rebecca asked. "Legally, historically, can we prove Thomas Whitmore was a serial killer?" David picked up Margaret's letter, holding it carefully by the edges. "This letter alone is extraordinary evidence. She explicitly states her fear, describes abuse, and says, if anything happens to her, it will not be an accident. Then she dies 2 weeks later. Any modern investigation would immediately suspect the husband." He moved to Grace Porter's testimony. A witness heard screaming, heard Catherine specifically say, "No, please no," then saw the body fall, and saw Thomas at the window immediately after. The police dismissed her because she was an unmarried woman and he was a wealthy man. Classic Victorian misogyny protecting a killer. Rebecca felt a surge of vindication. "So we can build a case." "We can build more than a case," David said, his eyes gleaming with the intensity she recognized from his lectures. "We can establish a pattern. Serial killers follow patterns, and Thomas Whitmore's pattern is obvious. Young wives, all in their early 20s, all married for less than 5 years, all dying in supposed accidents with no witnesses except Thomas himself, all deaths occurring in or near the home where he had complete control." He pulled out his laptop and began typing rapidly. "I am going to search for more. If Thomas killed 3 wives we know about, there might be others. Property records, marriage licenses, death certificates. Give me 2 hours." Rebecca watched as David disappeared into digital archives, his fingers flying across the keyboard. She returned to the physical documents, looking for anything else they might have missed. She found Thomas's financial records, thick ledgers documenting decades of business transactions. The man had been wealthy, obscenely so, real estate, manufacturing, import-export businesses. He had owned half of Chicago's South Side by the time he died. And then she found the payments. Hidden among legitimate business expenses were regular payments to the Chicago Police Department. Not official payments. Personal payments to specific officers. Detective William Morrison, Sergeant John Hayes, Captain Robert Lynch. Hundreds of dollars every month for years. Enormous sums in the 1880s. Thomas Whitmore had been paying the police. "David," she said quietly. "He was bribing the cops." David looked up from his laptop, his face grim. "That explains why investigations went nowhere. Show me the amounts." Rebecca showed him the ledgers. David whistled low. These payments would have been equivalent to 6 months' salary for each officer. He was not just bribing them. He was owning them. Every time a wife died, he made a payment within a week. Look, here. Margaret died July 12th, 1879. Payment to Detective Morrison, July 18th. Sarah died November 3rd, 1883. Payment to Captain Lynch, November 9th. "What about Catherine?" Rebecca asked, feeling sick. David flipped through the ledger pages. "Catherine died March 12th, 1888. Here, payment to Sergeant Hayes, March 15th. 3 days after her death, Hayes received $200. Rebecca sat down heavily. "He paid the police to cover up 3 murders." "At least 3, David said. He turned his laptop toward her. On the screen was a marriage license. "I found another wife, before Margaret. Her name was Anna Peterson. They married in 1876. She died in 1878. Cause of death: accidental poisoning from contaminated food." Rebecca felt the room spinning. 4 wives. 4 murders. Wait. David's face had gone pale. He was staring at his screen, his hands frozen over the keyboard. "Rebecca, there is another one. Thomas Whitmore married a woman named Eliza Harper in 1874, when he was 28 years old. She died 6 months later. Accidental death by fire. She supposedly fell asleep with a candle burning and her nightgown caught fire." 5, Rebecca whispered. 5 wives dead. David kept searching, his movements becoming frantic. Marriage records, death certificates, newspaper obituaries. The scope of Thomas Whitmore's crimes kept expanding with each new discovery. By the time the sun rose fully over Chicago, they had documented the truth. Thomas Whitmore had married 7 times over a span of 23 years. 6 of his wives had died in supposed accidents. Only the 7th wife, Helen, had survived. She had outlived Thomas, who died of a heart attack in 1912 at age 66. Helen had lived until 1943, dying at age 81. She had never remarried. She had never spoken publicly about her husband. And she had given birth to 1 son, Eleanor's father, who had inherited the entire Whitmore fortune. Rebecca stared at the wall of evidence they had built. 6 women murdered. 6 investigations dismissed or corrupted. 1 killer who lived free and wealthy until he died of natural causes in his own bed, never facing justice. "We have to tell their stories," she said. "We have to make sure everyone knows what he did to them." David nodded slowly. "We are going to expose everything, every murder, every bribe, every cover-up. Thomas Whitmore bought his way out of justice in life, but he cannot buy his way out of history." Rebecca looked at Catherine's wedding photograph one more time. The bruised wrist, the terrified eyes. "We are going to give them justice," she promised the silent, screaming girl in the photograph. 138 years late, but we are going to give you justice. The email came at 9:30 in the morning, just as Rebecca was preparing to present her findings to the museum director. The subject line made her stop breathing. "I know about Thomas Whitmore. My grandmother knew too." Rebecca clicked it open with trembling fingers. The sender was identified as Jennifer Morrison, and the message was brief but devastating. "Dr. Walsh, I saw the news article about the Whitmore collection being donated to your museum. My grandmother was Grace Porter, the neighbor who witnessed Sarah Whitmore's murder in 1883. Before she died in 1962, she told me everything. She said Thomas Whitmore had killed all his wives and that she had tried to tell the police, but they refused to listen. She kept records. I have her journals. Please call me." Rebecca's hands shook as she dialed the number. A woman answered on the first ring, her voice tight with emotion. "Thank you for calling so quickly. I have been waiting 40 years to tell someone this story." "Your grandmother kept journals?" Rebecca asked, barely able to form words. "Everything," Jennifer said. "Grace Porter was a schoolteacher. She was meticulous. She documented every suspicious thing she observed about Thomas Whitmore for over 30 years. Dates, times, descriptions of what she saw and heard, names of other people who had suspicions. She tried repeatedly to get the police to investigate. They threatened to have her committed to an asylum if she did not stop making accusations against a respectable man." 2 hours later, Jennifer Morrison arrived at the Chicago Historical Society, carrying a leather case containing her grandmother's journals. There were 12 of them, spanning from 1878 to 1910. Rebecca and David opened the first journal with reverent care. Grace Porter's handwriting was precise and controlled, the writing of a disciplined mind recording unbearable truths. The first entry about Thomas Whitmore was dated March 3, 1878, describing the death of Anna Peterson, his second wife. "I heard Anna Whitmore screaming last night. It went on for nearly an hour. This morning Dr. Harrison was summoned. I heard him tell Thomas that Anna had died from poison, likely from spoiled meat. But I had seen Anna just yesterday afternoon, and she appeared perfectly healthy. Thomas showed no grief whatsoever. He was making business arrangements before her body was even cold." The entries continued, year after year. Grace had documented everything: the arrival of each new bride, the sounds of violence coming from the Whitmore house, the screams in the night, the suspicious deaths, the police refusing to investigate, and something else, something that made Rebecca's blood freeze. Grace Porter had documented other families. November 15, 1885. I attended a charity function where I met Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, wife of Sergeant John Hayes. She confided in me that her husband receives substantial payments from Thomas Whitmore. She said there are other wealthy men who make similar payments. She mentioned names: Richard Sullivan, James Peterson, Alexander Morrison. She said the police protect these men no matter what they do. Rebecca looked at David, her heart pounding. She is saying there were other serial killers, other wealthy men paying off the police. This was not just Thomas Whitmore. This was systematic. David was already searching on his laptop. Richard Sullivan, married 4 times, 3 wives dead, all before age 30. James Peterson, married 5 times, 4 wives dead. Alexander Morrison, married 6 times, all 6 wives dead. He looked up, his face ashen. Grace Porter discovered a network of wife killers, all protected by corrupt police. Jennifer Morrison spoke quietly from her chair. My grandmother tried to expose them. In 1892, she compiled all her evidence and took it to a newspaper editor named William Stead. He was famous for investigating corruption. He believed her. He started investigating. "What happened?" Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer would be terrible. William Stead died in 1912 on the Titanic. But before that, his newspaper offices were burned down in 1893. All his files were destroyed. Grace was attacked on the street 2 weeks later by unknown assailants who told her to stop asking questions or she would disappear like the wives did. She was terrified, but she kept documenting everything in secret. Rebecca felt rage building in her chest. "How many women died?" David was typing frantically, pulling up records. "Based on what Grace documented and what I am finding in databases, we are looking at minimum 23 young women murdered by 5 different wealthy men over a 30-year period in Chicago. All deaths ruled accidental. All investigations shut down by paid police." 23, Rebecca repeated, the number feeling impossible. 23 women murdered, and nobody stopped it. Jennifer opened another journal, dated 1905. There is more. Grace documented the wives who survived. She tracked down Helen Whitmore, Thomas's 7th wife, the one who lived. Grace convinced her to meet secretly. Helen told her everything. Rebecca read the entry Jennifer indicated. Grace had written down Helen's testimony in careful detail. Helen Whitmore had survived because she had learned to be completely submissive, never arguing, never refusing, barely speaking unless spoken to. She had turned herself into a ghost in her own home to avoid triggering Thomas's rage. And she had done one more thing. "I never allowed myself to be alone with him in any elevated place or near water," Helen had told Grace. "I slept with my bedroom door locked and a knife under my pillow. When he demanded I unlock the door, I did, but I never truly slept when he was in the house. I survived by living in constant terror and never giving him an opportunity to stage an accident." Helen had lived 38 years in that state. 38 years of hypervigilance and fear, married to a man she knew was a serial killer, unable to leave because divorce was socially impossible, and running away would mean poverty and ruin. Rebecca closed the journal, feeling physically ill. Helen Whitmore lived in a prison. She survived, but she lived in a prison her entire marriage. David had found something else. Rebecca. Grace documented children. Some of these murdered wives had children from previous relationships or from early in their marriages. Grace tracked what happened to them. Thomas Whitmore sent Margaret's daughter from her first marriage to an orphanage. Sarah had a son who died at age 8 in an unexplained drowning. Catherine had a younger sister named Emma, who disappeared completely from records after Catherine's death. "He killed children too," Rebecca said, her voice breaking. "He murdered anyone who might inherit money or property that he wanted." Jennifer Morrison's face was wet with tears. "My grandmother spent 50 years documenting these crimes, and nobody would listen. She died knowing these men had never faced justice. She made me promise that if anyone ever investigated Thomas Whitmore, I would give them her journals. She wanted their stories told." Rebecca looked at the mountain of evidence spread across the table. Grace Porter's journals, Thomas Whitmore's financial records, marriage and death certificates for 23 murdered women, police bribery ledgers, witness statements that had been dismissed and buried. "We are going to tell every single story," Rebecca said. 23 women and their children. "We are going to name them all. We are going to expose every killer and every corrupt cop who helped them. This ends now. The exhibition opened 6 months later, on a cold March morning in 2026, exactly 138 years after Catherine Whitmore's death. Rebecca stood in the main gallery of the Chicago Historical Society, watching as the first visitors entered, and felt her throat tighten with emotion. The exhibition was called The Murdered Brides, Chicago's Hidden Serial Killers. It covered 3 entire gallery rooms. The walls were lined with photographs of 23 young women, each one accompanied by their name, their age, and the date they died. Catherine Brennan Whitmore, Margaret Hayes Whitmore, Sarah Collins Whitmore, Anna Peterson Whitmore, Eliza Harper Whitmore, Mary Sullivan, Dorothy Peterson. The names went on and on, a litany of stolen lives. In the center of the first gallery hung the wedding photograph that had started everything. Catherine's bruised wrist was visible even from across the room, magnified and highlighted. Beside it was the text of Margaret's unsent letter, blown up to fill an entire wall. Please, if anything should happen to me, know that it was not an accident. Visitors moved through the gallery in stunned silence. Rebecca watched their faces change as they absorbed the magnitude of what they were seeing. Shock, horror, rage, grief for women who had been dead for over a century, but whose suffering felt immediate and visceral. The second gallery contained the evidence of corruption. Grace Porter's journals were displayed in protective cases, open to key entries documenting murders and police cover-ups. The bribery ledgers were mounted on the walls, with amounts highlighted and translated to modern currency equivalents. Thomas Whitmore's diary entry about disciplining Catherine was printed in letters 3 feet high. Last night, I was forced to discipline her severely when she attempted to lock the bedroom door against me. A group of college students stood in front of that quote, and Rebecca heard one young woman say in a shaking voice, "He wrote it down. He was proud of it. He documented his abuse and faced no consequences." Her friends gathered around her, equally horrified. The third gallery was dedicated to the survivors and witnesses. Helen Whitmore's testimony to Grace Porter was printed alongside a photograph of Helen taken when she was 70 years old. Her face was lined and weary, her eyes distant. The accompanying text explained how she had survived 38 years of marriage to a serial killer through complete submission and constant vigilance. Visitors stood in front of Helen's portrait for long minutes, many with tears streaming down their faces. Grace Porter had her own section, celebrating her 50 years of documentation and her repeated, ignored attempts to seek justice. Jennifer Morrison had donated all 12 journals to the museum. They would be preserved forever, a testament to one woman's refusal to let these crimes be forgotten. But it was the final wall of the exhibition that affected visitors most powerfully. Rebecca and David had worked for months to research the descendants of the murdered women. They had found them. Catherine's younger sister Emma, who Rebecca had discovered had not disappeared but had been sent to live with distant relatives in Boston, had descendants living in Chicago today. Margaret's daughter from her first marriage, sent to an orphanage by Thomas, had survived and had children and grandchildren. Anna, Sarah, Eliza, Mary, Dorothy, all of them had living descendants who had never known how their ancestors died. Rebecca had contacted every single one of them. The final wall displayed their responses. Photographs of modern families holding pictures of their murdered ancestors. Written statements about what it meant to finally know the truth. One woman named Lisa Brennan, Catherine's great-great-grandniece, had written, "For 138 years, my family believed Catherine died in an accident. We mourned her as someone unlucky. Now we know she was murdered. Now we know she fought. Now we know she was brave. Her life mattered. Her death mattered. Thank you for giving us the truth." Rebecca watched as a tall woman with dark hair entered the gallery and stopped in front of Catherine's wedding photograph. The woman stared at it for a long time, then reached out and touched the glass gently. Rebecca recognized her from the photograph on the descendant wall. Lisa Brennan, Catherine's family. Rebecca approached carefully. "Thank you for coming." Lisa turned, her eyes red but her expression fierce. "I had to see it. I had to see her." She looked back at Catherine's terrified face in the photograph. "She looks like my daughter. Same eyes, same hair, same age. When I look at this picture, I see my Emma wearing a wedding dress and covered in bruises. And I want to reach back through time and save her. Catherine would have been your age when she died," Rebecca said quietly. 19 years old, barely an adult, sold to a monster by her father. "I want people to remember her name," Lisa said, her voice breaking. "Not Thomas Whitmore, not the killer. I want them to remember Catherine Brennan. I want them to know she existed. She had dreams. She had a life before him. She mattered." Rebecca nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The exhibition became national news within days. Major newspapers ran front-page stories about Chicago's hidden serial killers and the systemic corruption that protected them. Television networks produced documentaries. True crime podcasts dedicated entire seasons to investigating each of the 5 killers and their 23 victims. The Chicago Police Department issued a formal apology for the corruption of their predecessors and announced they were reviewing all suspicious deaths of women in their historical records. Universities began teaching about the case in criminology and history classes. Women's advocacy groups used the exhibition as evidence of how wealth and power have historically protected abusers. Descendants of the corrupt police officers who had taken bribes issued public statements condemning their ancestors' actions. But most importantly, people remembered the names: Catherine Brennan, Margaret Hayes, Sarah Collins, Anna Peterson, Eliza Harper, Mary Sullivan, Dorothy Peterson. 23 women whose deaths had been dismissed and forgotten were finally acknowledged, finally mourned, finally given the justice they had been denied in life. Rebecca stood in the gallery on the final day of the exhibition, 6 months after it opened. More than 200,000 people had visited. The guest book contained thousands of messages, many from women who saw their own experiences reflected in these historical murders, who recognized the patterns of abuse and control that transcended centuries. One message, written in careful handwriting by an elderly woman, made Rebecca cry every time she read it. "I was married to a violent man for 40 years. I survived like Helen Whitmore survived by making myself small and silent. I thought I was weak. This exhibition taught me I was strong. Thank you for showing me that surviving is its own form of resistance. Thank you for remembering the ones who did not survive." Rebecca looked one last time at Catherine's wedding photograph, at those terrified eyes that had started everything. "We remembered you," she whispered. "All of you. We remembered."